Yeah, please. I've got lots.
Great. Okay, I'll call the Teaching and Learning Committee to order. Only thing on our agenda today is to go over our math adoption materials. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Battle to.
Thank you so much, Board Member Tyler. Thank you for allowing time for us to go over the mathematics material adoption and where we are to date. We have Dr. David Williams and Jessica Slayton here who will lead us through the presentation. I'll just say at the front of this presentation before they start, I'm really proud of our teachers who've been part of the committee and the work of our leadership through the support hub and making sure that we have a solid plan that will lead us to adopting high-quality materials like we did in literacy for numeracy as well. So, Dr. Williams, I will turn it over to you first.
Thank you, Dr. Battle. Good afternoon, Chair Tyler, board members. I'll be presenting here with Jessica Slayton, our amazing Director of Mathematics. I also want to recognize Amber Tennille. She's our Coordinator of Mathematics here in the audience, and Jill Petty, our Executive Director of Curriculum Instruction, wasn't able to be here today. But we're pleased to be able to present to you our math instructional materials that are recommended by our teacher committees. Our agenda is pretty straightforward. I will quickly review the adoption process that Jessica shared back to you on January 24th in great detail. And then Jessica will give an overview of the committee recommendations, and then we'll end by sharing next steps. Focusing exclusively on mathematics this afternoon, we are directly targeting our numeracy-focused outcome, while adopting and subsequently implementing new materials certainly requires us to do so with each of the four core tenets in mind. So to review our process quickly, we had several goals for our mathematics local materials adoption. First, we wanted to make sure that the process was very thorough. Yes, the strongest in the state. We wanted it to be fair, transparent, and rigorous, and certainly in compliance with all statute and local policy and procedure. Our review will be guided by the unique needs of MNPS students and families. And this is important to note because while the state identifies a list of materials from which we can choose locally, we empower our committees to seek materials that may not be on the state list, which might require a waiver, even if that's what we decide is best. It also meant that we took the state screening rubric and modified it based on local needs and input from our teachers. We also offered multiple opportunities for a variety of stakeholders to be involved and give input and guidance. Specifically, our community review of the materials that happened in January, our advisory council, we had teachers again who gave voice to which criteria within the rubric should be weighted more heavily based on what they were looking for in materials. And finally, our students who gave responses to the teachers who were piloting the lessons in their classes. Our committees, which were approved by our board on October 25th last fall, represented a diverse cross-section of teachers across the district, thinking about grades, years of experience, the schools, and all quadrants across the district. And today, we are proud to bring this recommendation to the board for adoption that will go into effect this fall. On slide, you can see a timeline of some key events. Our committees were selected nearly a year ago, and they've been working really, really hard since last spring. I want to remind everyone that our teachers participate in this rigorous process with no compensation. Our committee members put in many, many hours of their own time to review and score the materials in depth. I'm going to go ahead and click through all of the various stakeholder groups that have been represented, and you can see that we have broad involvement to our process. One of our goals mentioned earlier. We are grateful to everyone who provided feedback, and specifically we had 366 comments to the materials that were available both at MNPS back in January and online for review and comment, which our committees reviewed and took into consideration during final scoring and selections. Finally, as a reminder, our teacher committees are broken into subcommittees across the different grade bands, and each subcommittee also has a table facilitator to ensure equity of voice and to press members to score the materials based on evidence. And table facilitators were not scoring members. I do want to quickly provide information about the authority given to the board that's found in statute, specifically 49.6.2207. Not only are boards authorized to adopt, they are required to do so. And what this means is that following the state cycle, each content area, roughly 6 years by the state, the board must adopt materials for those respective content areas following the state cycle. And this year, of course, is math. The board may adopt from the list provided by the state unless a waiver is approved, and for a period of no less than 3 years and up to 6, which is the common length of the contract. Additionally, we are clear with our committees that their job is to make a recommendation to you. They do not adopt, they make a recommendation, and the board is the body that provides the final adoption. So with that, I'll turn things over to Jessica.
I am honored to have the opportunity to share some of the evidence that our teachers gathered during the review process and communicate their recommendations to you. As David mentioned earlier, we have 5 different subcommittees who engaged in extensive training and a rigorous review process of the available materials. They scored each set of materials on 30 different indicators aligned to the MNPS instructional framework. Early in the process, the subcommittees decided that coherence in the recommended materials was important. It was their desire to cooperate and communicate throughout the process to ensure that as students matriculate through the grades, they would have a coherent learning experience. Together, the K2 and 3-5 subcommittees are recommending Accelerate Learning's STEM Scopes Math. The STEM Scopes materials are designed to engage students in an inquiry-based, student-centered instructional experience. They use hands-on activities, collaboration, and rich classroom discussion to support students as they engage in real-world problem solving. All the exploratory lessons in the STEM Scopes materials include 3 levels of language acquisition strategies, and each unit is accompanied by a letter that teachers can distribute to families that provide an overview of the content and suggests resources and activities that families can engage in together to support math learning at home. In the evidence gathered during their review, the committees highlighted that the materials had strong supports for teachers that would ensure instruction is aligned to the rigor of the grade level standards. Additionally, the committees appreciated the prompts for student reflection embedded within the materials for how they supported SEL integration. The grades 6 through 8 subcommittee and the integrated math subcommittees together recommend the adoption of the Open Up resources, our 6-8 Math Tennessee and our High School Math Tennessee. Similar to the K-5 recommendation, these materials support an inquiry-based, student-centered instructional model that consistently incorporates collaboration and rich discussion, both for real-world and mathematical problem solving. All the Open Up lessons include embedded mathematical language routines to support active engagement of multilingual learners. Additionally, each unit in the Open Up resources includes a letter that can be shared with families that provides an overview of the learning of the unit and suggested resources and activities that families can engage in to support mathematical learning at home. In the evidence gathered by these committees during their review, the committees were impressed with the consistent inclusion of cognitively demanding grade-level tasks that provide multiple entry points for students. Having materials with multiple entry points ensures that students can use their own strengths to make sense of and engage in grade-level mathematics. The teachers on the review committee also noted that the teacher supports in the materials were strong, providing look-fors and listen-fors that they could utilize when monitoring collaborative work time. The subcommittee tasked with reviewing materials for the high school 4th courses recommend Elementary Statistics by Triola and Pre-Calculus Enhanced with Graphic Utilities by Sullivan. Upon their review of these materials, the teachers found that these two sets of materials address the full breadth of the standards and also include opportunities for collaborative projects and activities, which is fairly uncommon in materials for higher level courses. So let's situate these recommendations into the larger landscape of what's happening in mathematics in Tennessee right now. The last time I had the opportunity to speak with you, I believe I shared this local adoption of materials graphic and shared that this adoption is part of a larger process that included a review and a revision of the K-12 Tennessee math standards. As a result of that review and revision, we know that the Tennessee Department of Education has removed the major work of the grade designation for some of the standards. So now all the standards hold the same level of importance. Additionally, standards were revised and in some cases added or shifted to a new grade level to improve coherence across the grade levels. In grades 6 through 12, the revised standards include a greater emphasis on statistics to reflect the growing need for data literacy and data-based decision-making in our society. And finally, in the bullets at the bottom of the slide, you can see the degree to which each grade band was impacted by the revisions. I want to call your attention to the fact that only 13% of the high school math standards in the fall will be unchanged from what was taught this year. That was the tier that was most significantly impacted by this change. But thinking about this review, the materials that they reviewed and adopted are aligned to these new standards that will go into effect. Because of the significant changes to the standards, we have already begun rolling out the revised standards and helping teachers become familiar with the content that they'll be teaching in the fall. In January, we met with principals and gave them a high-level overview about the changes to the standards. We asked each school to identify a math ambassador who would be trained and then re-deliver that content in their buildings. We trained the math ambassadors for each tier during 2 half-day sessions, one in February and one in March. Ambassadors were tasked with working with their administration to determine the best time frame and model for re-delivery in their buildings. The training materials were designed in such a way that they could re-deliver it in pieces or all at one time to provide schools with flexibility in their training plan. And though some schools started re-delivering in February, the bulk of the re-delivery across the district will occur between March and May. Though this is a train-the-trainer model, we are calling it a hybrid PD because all of the content is delivered via video that was developed and recorded by my team, but then periodically during the video, the ambassador pauses and engages the school level teams in activities and discussions so that they can process that content together. And we decided on this model to ensure that every teacher was getting a consistent message, but they could still collectively process and talk through that information with their colleagues in their buildings. Artifacts from each of the school-level discussions and activities are submitted to my team via Schoology so that we can determine if school teams need any additional support or follow-up. We're asking all schools to complete their re-delivery by the end of May so that teachers are aware of the changes in the standards prior to being trained on the new instructional materials this summer. And David is going to share some additional news as well.
Thank you, Jessica. As the board is aware, MNPS has partnered with Vanderbilt and Peer, Partnership for Educational Equity and Research, with multiple projects underway, and one such project seeks to understand how we can best ensure alignment across the organization in support of a clear, consistent vision of instructional excellence in mathematics. One of the first outcomes of this work will be to collaboratively design and co-facilitate a session during Principal Landing in June on instructional leadership for mathematics. As we prepare for implementation of the materials this fall, just a few notes about how we are thinking about getting started. Upon adoption by the board, we will quickly begin working with the publishers to plan our summer professional learning. We will work closely with them to see what their PD looks like. It must be high quality, and we want to make sure that it's tailored to meet our needs. We've budgeted for all teachers and staff to receive 2 days of professional learning at their full daily rate this summer. And it's important to note that while the math department is certainly leading the implementation, we will be collaborating across the district with various departments to make sure we have a consistent front and united message as we put supports in place. We will also work with the publishers to make sure that while we're ordering the physical copies that will arrive in schools later this spring and in the summer, that they have early access to preview the materials and review them online. And then finally, our math department is already gearing up to develop the revised scope and sequence with the materials, so the teams of teachers can be made, these can be available later to teachers this spring. So finally, how can the board support? Fingers crossed that you will note the recommendation that Jessica shared with you earlier just now. They appear on your consent agenda, item 1F. Next, it will be important to ensure that the materials are fully funded over the span of the adoption, which we expect to be 6 years. We will spend all allowable ESSER funds that are currently budgeted for these materials and anticipate future years local funding will also be needed. And finally, we want to work, this is personally important to me, we want to work to help folks realize that everyone is capable of being a math person. Just like we believe every student can learn to read, we believe that every student can learn meaningful mathematics. We'd appreciate your help and conversations you have with parents, your constituents, your communities, that as a district we're committing to making sure mathematics is accessible for all students. And so with that, Chair Tyler, I'll turn it back to you.
Very much. That was very thorough. I appreciate it. Does anybody have any questions?
What's the dollar sign? I mean, what's the dollar amount over 6 years? Oh, I'm sorry.
What's the dollar amount over 6 years?
Over 6 years, good question. We budgeted around $14 million, but that's K-12. K-12.
Did you say with a B?
No, ma'am, million.
Oh, okay.
14 million.
I was going to say, what?
But this is where we will have to work with the publisher to make sure we're fully invested in all the manipulatives, all the kits, all the workbooks that go into the program and the online access. And so there are different packages available. We want to fully fund and get best in class, certainly. But we haven't been able to engage in those conversations with publishers yet because we're bringing the adoption to the board this evening. As soon as that happens, we'll be able to go get in dollar price. We have budgeted and are presuming it's going to be around $14 million over the 6 years.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
No, if you have more questions.
Yeah, I have a follow-up. So you had mentioned it's $14 million over 6 years, and you said a portion of that will come out of ESSER. Do we know what that portion is that will come out of ESSER versus local funding?
We want to pay for as much as we can up front with ESSER while it's available. Because generally the materials are now more consumable, we can only buy sort of 1 year at a time. In other words, we can't pay for 6 years worth of consumables when ESSER funds in 2024. So we have to be mindful of some legalities and restrictions around the allowable use of ESSER funds. But when you look at things like manipulative kits that would sustain this full 6 years, we can pay for that out of ESSER, and then we'll just have it and just have to do replacement costs. But we want to pay for as much up front as we possibly can for the 6 years. But it's just things like consumables that have to have recurring expenses that we'll have to shift over to local in the future years.
Do we have any idea what that amount is like right now? Okay.
Off the top of my head.
That's it. Thank you.
But I could say we anticipate paying fully for at least 2 years. So 1/3 of the 2 of the 6 years would be paid with ESSER. So you could think of it that way. But probably more, like I said, if we could buy a lot of the non-recurring expenses up front.
Thank you.
So I have a couple of questions about the materials themselves. So I know you all talked about the standards alignment. Can you talk a little bit about standards alignment and materials alignment, sort of as they intersect? And also, just this year, I believe we're using illustrative math in K through 5. Is that right? And all All the way through, okay. Just like sort of, how similar or different are these new materials from the materials that are currently being used? Can you talk a little bit about the transition for teachers, what that'll look like?
Sure. For the first part of your question, the standards that the state board approved, I think were available in 2020.
No, for that. I think they were sent to publishing companies in 2020
Yeah.
when they were made available to them.
So they came online a couple of years ago. I want to clarify that the last time the state reviewed standards and revised them for mathematics was 17-18, and we were using materials from 14-15. So there were standards were revised mid-cycle of the last adoption. So they put those in place. 17-18, we had old materials. Then, anticipating these new standards being revised to go into effect this fall of 23, they delayed the math adoption materials by 2 years so that they coincided. Okay, so that's just a little bit of context around why these changes and the timing of it. The 2-year gap caused us to say, well, we have materials from 14-15, and if we wait 2 more years, we'll have 8-year-old materials in our classrooms that were, by my estimation, not very strong. So we had an opportunity to bridge that 2-year gap by inserting stronger materials. So the first thing is when the publishers submit their materials to the state, they have to be 100% aligned to the standards. If they're not aligned to the new standards, they were not reviewed for quality or usability or anything else. So that's how they're aligned. So we have had the materials, the standards for a few years. The state review certainly required them to be aligned to the standards. And then our teams were to look at those materials and say, okay, if they're aligned to the standards, what does that mean for meeting the needs of the district? Usability, language supports for EL students, et cetera. The other part of your question about the consistency, while we certainly have provided supports on the new materials that we've had the last 2 years, again, for that 2-year span, we're also looking at this as a clean slate. We focus a lot on the philosophy of excellent mathematics instruction, which is high-level tasks, maintaining the demands of the task, ensuring rigorous mathematical discourse. Those are the things that we put in place so that when we finally got to this point with the new adoption of the materials, we could kind of plug those in and move forward with our mathematical mission and vision. But we are looking at this as sort of a clean slate. We haven't required the training that we will this summer because those weren't our adopted materials in the past. The last part, as I will say, the secondary materials open up are very similar to the illustrative math materials that we have in place now.
A bigger shift in the K through 5.
Slightly bigger shift in K-5, right?
Can you also just talk about, I know we previously approved request for waiver to the state based on materials. Can you talk about sort of what happened there? And just in that meeting, I recall you all mentioning where the materials were in terms of the ed reports.
Right.
If you could talk about that as well.
Sure. So the first on the waiver, as I mentioned in my remarks earlier, we take the state list that was published back in the fall. I want to say around September, and we present that to our committees. Okay, and then they can look through the materials. They can Google them. They can look on ed reports. What do you find about them? Let's get some previews. We can look online and see what the materials are about. Then we can also say, but are there other materials out there that you're aware of, looking on ed reports that are not on the state list that you might be interested in reviewing? They found a couple that they were interested in reviewing that were not on the state list. That required to go through a waiver process with the state board. The way we have approached our waiver process, though, is not to say this is what we select, now we would like the state to approve a waiver, is we would like to get our waiver approved so that our committees have the confidence that if I want to review these 3 materials, I don't have to worry about if they'll be approved by the state or not. They're already good to go. In other words, we had 2 that were on the list, the state textbook list. We required for, say, Carnegie and middle school to be on a waiver. But that empowered our committee to say we want to look at all 3 of these materials. They did not choose Carnegie, but they had the option to because we requested the waiver for the state board. So that's how that process worked mechanically. And remind me of the second part of your question.
You talked then about where the materials that we were approving for waiver were on ed reports. If you could just say with Open Up and STEM Scopes.
With Open Up, certainly all green, highly rated on ed reports. STEM Scopes, my understanding is they're not currently available.
Yes, there's not an ed report on the STEM Scopes materials at this time.
And do we know anything about why not? Or is that just like can you say something about just sort of the strength of those materials, given what we have used in the past as one of our criteria, which is sort of where it appears on Ed Reports?
So the committees, we did partner with Ed Reports, and they supported us through the review process, rubric development, all of that. They, as an organization, have things in their queue. Their review is even more extensive than what our teachers did. It takes, I think, 6 months for them to do their review. And so they can, as quickly as they can review things, they do. But we have things that are just there are things that are in their queue that just haven't been finalized. And I believe that that's where STEM Scopes is, because it's, I think, fairly newer.
Yeah, but I could take some, I could sort of look at what you just said and think to myself, okay, Ed Reports was supporting you all throughout this process. This is a set of materials that more likely than not, once they get around to reviewing them, will have a high level of confidence in.
Safe assumption.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate your answers to all of those questions.
Thank you. So we have on the rollout training, it is very heavy on the math ambassadors, and I understand that there's going to be the hybrid trainer model. What were the requirements for these ambassadors when they were being decided upon by the administration of that school?
We recommended that schools select people in a non-classroom role to give them flexibility to be out of the building for the training, and then also flexibility in redelivery in case they needed to do that at different times with different groups of teachers. So we also specified that they should be strong facilitators, because their role was more around helping there be productive conversation, charting those conversations, helping teachers engage with the readings that they were doing and engage with that content. They did not have to be mathematics experts, because they're not delivering any of the actual information about the standards. That part is included in the video. So they just needed those facilitation skills to help people stay focused, engaged, and be able to organize and scheduling the sessions.
And then when we are tasking them to do these sessions, if there are questions outside of that scope, because they are not the experts, like you're saying, with the videos, do they have the direct access to get those answers, or do they have to go through multiple steps, or what's the process to get that quickly to our teachers?
Yes, so each of the sessions, we ask them to have a parking lot present in their room, and then we have a discussion post on Schoology that says unanswered questions from your redelivery. And so we have been checking that every day to see if there are any unanswered questions, so we can directly contact that school's ambassador and make sure that they have the answers that they need.
Okay, great. Have we noticed any trends within those questions or needs?
We have very few schools who have redelivered.
I would think so.
And not very many unanswered questions for those who have. Some of the things, no, there are no trends. No.
I wouldn't think so, because it's so fresh. But I was like, if we're already doing it, are there trends? Because we're already, okay. I remember your very detailed presentation from January, and I really appreciate it, and the rubric and the thoughtfulness of trying to implement this, especially from all of the learnings that we had with our language implementation and or ELA implementation. I know that the training was an ongoing conversation during that, and so I'm glad to know that we're able to provide 2 paid days. Can I get some clarity on who those 2 paid days are for? Did you say teachers and staff? And if it is staff, what staff is that?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Anyone who's involved in either directly or indirectly supporting math instruction in the building. So we definitely want to include EL teachers, EE teachers, content teachers, self-contained teachers, anyone who is either going to be delivering math instruction or direct support of delivering math instruction.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Does that include our paras? Because they do provide at times academic assistance.
If they are providing that assistance, we definitely want to include them. Absolutely.
Okay. Do they have to sign up for that PD themselves, or is that something that we recognize and sign them up on their behalf?
We'll ask all individuals to register through HCM, so we'll have a series of sessions available throughout the year, and we'll have to work with the publishers to think about where any limitations on cap size, for what's available, but they'll register independently that way.
Okay. Again, I appreciate all the work that went into this from your team. I know that was a very thoughtful approach, and giving us, of course, the additional information today and giving us a lot of information about training and how it's not just a one-time event, but it's going to be an ongoing rollout. So I appreciate that.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I have a follow-up really quick, if you don't mind. Mm-hmm. Okay. Not consumables, manipulatives. So the previous math adoption, how long was it 8 years?
15, so implementation the fall of 15 was the last time we had a new math curriculum.
Then never mind. I was asking about the manipulatives. Do we have lots of manipulatives left over from previous curriculum that we could use towards this new one? But if it's 8 years, never mind.
Follow-up? No. Well, great. You guys asked some great questions that I also had, so thank you for that. And I just have a very few follow-ups. One, do the facilitators who do not have to be a classroom teacher or who you do not want to be, do they have to have had previous classroom experience as a teacher?
For the standards rollout training?
Yes.
All of them do. We have assistant principals, we have some numeracy coaches, we had some executive principals, some deans, so we have a variety of different roles, but all of them,
Okay.
yes, are previous teachers.
Okay, great, because that makes a difference in how you answer questions if you have understanding of what the reality of a classroom is. So.
And we did give them the opportunity to go through the training as a learner first so that they could engage in it. And then we stepped out of the process to say, okay, now that you've engaged in it, let's think about what your role is in redelivery. But we wanted not to just train them on the redelivery process, but also make sure that they had the time and space to process the information themselves as well.
Okay, thank you. And then what's the new plan for new hires after our summer sessions are completed? Are there going to be rolling PDs? Is it going to be a certain number of times a year?
We asked for schools to redeliver by the end of May, knowing that we didn't want people to transfer schools and miss a training. We have that content in-service day in August, so we will offer the standards training at that time as well, but we know that won't get everyone. We have late hires after that time as well, so we will offer some in the fall as well.
Okay. And then will that be, will they have to use their professional development days to attend those classes, or how will that be coded to them? Because in the summer, they're being paid their rate to come and take the training, but during the school year, they're going to have to get a sub, and I just want to make sure that's...
We haven't decided on the format for that in the fall. Potentially, it could be a virtual self-paced piece as well. We haven't decided on how that will look. So if it were in person, then that would likely be a professional development day. That it would be technically half a day. It's 3 hours.
Okay, great. And then, do we know, based on our information, what percentage of each of these curriculums are consumable and which percentage are evergreen?
Each student has a workbook that is consumable.
Yes.
So that piece. Definitely. The teacher's edition is not a it is soft-bound, I believe, but it is intended to be used multiple years.
Yeah.
Yes. And then the manipulatives and those pieces would be consistent. I have not yet met with the publishers, so I'm not sure of some of the other pieces, if they have kits that you could purchase with center activities or games. I know that those are included as part of the materials. I'm not sure if those are considered to be consumable or repeat.
They call those durable goods. But I think a lot of publishing companies have moved away from just the hardback textbook that's $120 for a few reasons. It's heavy and it hurt kids' backs to carry back and forth. But over the life of 6 years, they go under sometimes irreparable damage, and that costs even more money. So, and it costs no more to have consumable or hardback. But that's the way a lot of committees have, our publishers rather have started print their materials, and that way a student only has a workbook that lasts 6 to 8 weeks because they're by unit, and so they just keep up with that, and then they move on to the next workbook.
That's technically for the second.
That's elementary.
The elementary is not by.
The secondary, I was referring to secondary by unit that way.
Yes.
Okay. I think that seems to be most of our questions. You guys have been very thorough, and we appreciate the follow-up, having prepped us in January when you gave us our initial understanding of this. So I really appreciate that, and then coming back to us with the thorough understanding of every step that happened to get to this point. So I appreciate that, and I thank you for your time.
Ms. Tyler, thank you for the feedback again. Just very proud of our teaching and learning team. I mean, you've said it. We've got the top leaders across our disciplines and who create processes and are well informed around best practices. And so I share the same sentiment around the thoroughness that you all have led with and the thoughtfulness around what works best here in MNPS. So thank you for your feedback, and thank you all for your leadership with this adoption cycle.
Very mathematical. Now, we do not need to vote now. Is that correct?
That's on the consent agenda.
It's on, because it's on the agenda, but do we also have to vote now?
No, this
Okay.
is not required to vote.
That's what I was double checking
You
on.
could, but it's not involved.
That's fine. Well, if we don't need to, it's already on our agenda to vote on in our meeting at 5 o'clock, so we don't have anything to vote on now. Does anybody have any further questions they wish to ask about this? Okay, well, with that, I'll adjourn us.